Hey guys, today we're in the book of Leviticus chapter 13. Now remember, we're in this section of purity. We've talked about the ritual sacrifices, we've talked about the priest being ordained, and now we're about the ritual purity. How can you remain pure? And today was a long chapter. Chapter 13 is a long chapter. And it's all about the word leprosy. Now, we got to understand leprosy. When we think leprosy today, we think of kind of like this disease that you get from armadillos. It's still around, but you've got to understand, in the days of the Bible times, they couldn't specifically know if it was leprosy or not. So when it says leprosy, lots of things get kind of clumped in to leprosy, right? So you might have psoriasis, you might have ringworm, you might have all different types of skin diseases and of irritations. And so here, God is giving the priest laws and regulations on how they know if it's gonna be okay or if it's bad. And when I say it's bad, it means that it's going to spread, right? It's going to spread to the rest of Israel. So in this, it's about being pure, but it's also about keeping Israel pure themselves, right? So even though it's leprosy, think about it kind of like yeast. You know how we refer to many times in Scripture already that yeast is sin? We kind of see that same idea, that leprosy, something that can spread and can affect a lot of things, needs to be kept away, needs to be kept moved away. And so with this idea of leprosy, even though it's talking about sickness and diseases and boils and burns and all types of idea, the whole point is to bring to the idea of what is purity. What is good? What is bad? What should we have more of? What should we have less of? What should we draw close to? And what should we run away from? So that whole idea on leprosy that we read about talks about this idea that we have now in chapter 13. It's the first that we see. Priests were not just people who did sacrifices. A lot of them did that, but there would have been a section of priests who were kind of like the public health officers of the day, right? They were kind of like this the CDC, and so God is giving them some directions on how that they could best keep Israel pure, could keep them without infection, that they would be different than anybody else, that they would remain pure, right? And so it talks about, starting in chapter 13, giving priests on how they should investigate, kind of this idea of what it should be, and if somebody has it, what should you do with it? And so it gives them a lot of things that we read, right? If one has a white hair, if it has a black hair, if it has a yellow hair, a lot of things that we read today and think, for one, gross, but for two, why is this in the Bible, right? It's in the Bible because it's God teaching them pure and impure. What is just a little infection and what will take over the whole body, right? What's just something that's small and what's something that will be big, right? Something small that is unkept and unwatched will become something big and serious. So even though there are real medical and health benefits to chapter 13, there is a spiritual side to this idea of this sickness of leprosy taking over not only a person, but a lot of people, right? And so that's the idea. Notice in verse 10, it says, the priest shall look, and there will be a white swelling in the skin, and they're turned the hair white, and there will be raw flesh in the swelling. The biggest difference is raw flesh, right? If it is eating into, if it is destroying skin and leaving open wounds, then it's bad. You've got to get it away. Something that rips, something that tears, something that hurts, something that eats flesh, you got to get it out, right? We see in verse 13, it says that it has turned white, he is clean. But when raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean, right? This idea of a person covered from head to toe being all white, we would think, ooh, gross, get him away. But white is the color of healing, right? And so somebody that is healing and there's no raw flesh anywhere, he's getting better. So he can become clean. But once again, if there's raw flesh, it is bad. Starting in verse 18, it starts talking about boils. Starting in verse 24, it talks about burns. In verse 29, it talks about sores on the head. Verses 38 talks about white spots or bright spots on the skin. Verse 40, it talks about hair loss. Oh my goodness, right? Hair loss. I found my life verse in 40 and 41, right? If a man's hair falls out from his forehead, he has baldness of the forehead. That's a brilliant verse, right? But this whole idea of sores on the head or on the face that is causing hair loss, what should be done about it? And then we see in verse 45 kind of the results. Basically, if they do have leprosy, what do they have to do? They have to let their hair on their head hang loose, which means their head would not be covered. He shall cover his upper lip. That's an interesting phrase, right? And so it doesn't mean that he would grow a mustache. He would already have a mustache, but it means that you would veil the face. You would put a piece of cloth here hanging down. You would veil the face, only showing the eyes. And also he would have to cry out, unclean, unclean, right? So think about what this is. When something is bad, it's put out, something is tearing it apart and is hurting the person. They are kicked out of camp. They must cover themselves. They must be in perpetual mourning. And then anytime somebody comes around, they would have to yell, unclean, unclean. And then we see they have to live outside of the community. And so they would be kicked out of the community of Israel. It says in several places that we've already kind of passed over that he must live alone. We will find out later that it doesn't mean that they have to live alone by themselves, but they would live alone outside of the community of Israel. But we will see that lepers create their own communities. And so people that have leprosy can live with people that have other leprosy because they already have it. And they kind of create their own communities. Then starting in verse 47 becomes some weird language, right? It's all about the fabrics and the garments and the leathers and seeing if it should have leprosy. And you might have thought, what? Fabrics having leprosy? Remember, the word leprosy is used very loosely here, right? The leprosy wasn't necessarily a thing yet, right? So it's kind of like nobody really knows what it is. It was just a visible skin and health issue. And so how would fabric get it? This idea of leprosy on fabric is something that we would call today mold, fungus. So you got to think about if you have fabrics and you're living in a house that's made of fabric, you're living in tents, there's not a lot of washing in the desert. It's an idea that says if your fabrics are covered with mold and fungus, they would make them sick. So here God puts in that says if the fabric has leprosy, here's how you can wash it. If you wash it a couple times, it doesn't, you can tear it off and reuse the rest. But if it keeps growing back, just get rid of it, destroy it, right? Once again, it's an idea of keeping what is pure and what is not, what is good and what is not, what is holy and what is not. And so it goes through this whole idea of fabrics. And you would maybe ask yourself, okay, I get it for the people of Israel, but what does this got to do with us, right? What does this whole idea of leprosy have to do with us? Well, I doubt very much that we'll have somebody with leprosy in our church, but we have people that have spiritual leprosy, who have sin that is visible. And when it is visible, as a community, we must protect the community. Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians and in 2 Corinthians about what sin will do to the church when it comes in. And so when this visible sin comes into the church, there must be some steps taken because it's all about what is holy and pure and what is not. And our job is not to degrade, to go further away from the holiness, but to grow closer to that holiness, right? So I hope that makes sense. And you would ask yourself, well, where is Jesus in this chapter? Well, with all the talk of leprosy, maybe you'd be called some parables and some stories of some lepers that Jesus did. And tomorrow, when we get into chapter 14, it deals even more with people. On what lepers have to do, and you're going to see a great connection between leprosy and Jesus, and maybe bring a new love for what Jesus did for the lepers. I hope that makes sense, and we'll see you tomorrow in chapter 14. God bless.